Center. As all of you who have attended in the past, and it's wonderful, I think there are a few people who've been to every lecture, and there are a few people who've been to almost every one, and it's just wonderful that you keep coming back to these great talks. This series is made possible by a continuing and generous grant from the Regis Foundation and by the very easy co-sponsorship and great assistance of the Minneapolis Institute of Arts. Both Susan Jacobson and Luke Erickson are terrific to work with, and I just want to acknowledge them. And Susan did point out that there's a kind of 2-week period here of an interregnum, and so I could kind of say anything I wanted because there's nobody in charge. So, I mean, I'm sure that's not completely true. This series started 8 years ago with a lecture by Warren McKenzie in the fall of 1997 when we opened our new building. The first 13 clay masters honored in the series spent the majority of their careers working in this country. We then expanded the scope to include master artists from around the world, and this year we came back to America with John Mason in March and today's honoree and lecturer Val Cushing. Val Cushing was born in Rochester, New York in 1931. He received his BFA from the School of Art and Design in the New York State College of Ceramics at Alfred in 1952 and his MFA in 1956. He left for a brief time and went to the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana, but then returned to Alfred where he taught for the next 41 years. He left periodically to visit other schools and centers around the U.S. and the world to teach, but spent his career at Alfred training many of the people in this room or their teachers. Honors included grants from the National Endowment for the Arts and the Fulbright Foundation, and designation as a Fellow of the American Craft Council and the National Council on Education for the Ceramic Arts, of which he was a founding board member. He now works full-time in his studio, making his elegant and distinctively functional pots, which you will be able to see in the exhibition in March. The forms and surfaces of his organic, sensual covered jars and bowls invite touch and communicate the beauty of making and use. His pottery has received many awards and has been seen in over 200 exhibitions, including numerous one-person shows, and is in many museum collections across the country. If there is a lodestar institution in 20th century American ceramic education, it probably is the New York State College of Ceramics at Alfred. There are a number of other notable ceramics programs in universities and art schools, including the University of Minnesota here, where we have a very strong ceramics program. But Alfred has shone brightly for potters and sculptors since the late 1940s. Val, a potter who taught at Alfred from 57 to 97, is responsible for a considerable period of that light. It seems especially fitting that he is speaking today at the close of the American Pottery Festival. As those of you who came to the APF may have noticed, we had a number of new potters participating, and as I was proofing the program guide, a lot of P's there, I noticed a common thread. An awful lot of them went to Alfred. There are a couple of quotations in an article that Val sent us that I would like to pass along to you. One is a quote from someone else, but it seemed particularly appropriate somehow in these times. It was a quotation from Saul Bellow, who said, or wrote probably, "A great deal of intelligence can be invested in ignorance when the need for illusion runs deep." Nice thought. The second is from Val himself. "Never before have so many people throughout the world made things in clay. What I hope for is a de-emphasis on short routes to success and less concern about whether or not what we make belongs in the art world." I think clearly the pots that were in the APF belong in any world, whether it's defined as art or craft. One of the selfish delights of this program has been the opportunity it's given me to get to know some of the most interesting artists of the last century and this century. I occasionally get to learn kind of odd little, maybe, I don't think they're secret, but odd facts or behaviors or whatever about these men and women. A number of us last night learned that Val is one of those people you want to have with you in New York, because he can do the best taxi whistle I have ever heard in my life. It is amazing. And so I thought, in honor of that skill, would you all join me in a whistling welcome for Val Cushing?
I don't dare demonstrate that, or I'm afraid I would break the microphone here. I can't tell you what a pleasure it is to be here, and an honor, certainly. It's one I never ever thought about receiving, and it means a great deal to me. And I want to thank Emily and the Northern Clay Center and the Minneapolis Institute of the Arts. I think the program is wonderful. It's nice to be part of it, but even if I wasn't, it's a wonderful program, because I guess I have to call myself amongst the elders of American ceramics. I certainly am, being 74 years old, but all the people who have received this award here are people that, with one or two exceptions, that I know, and most of them I know quite well. And I have known, most of them have been doing this about the same amount of time I have. So we kind of grew up together, and it means so much to me to be part of that group, because I admire every single one of them, and I admire what they've achieved. So it's tremendously, it's such a tremendous pleasure to be part of that program. And I want to tell you, Minnesota, I was here twice. Once I drove through and hardly saw anything, and once I was here for the ANSICA conference in 94, 95, where the Northern Clay Center was in a different facility. The one here now is spectacular. I think you're so lucky to have such an opportunity in the city, and it's a great pleasure to be there. And I want to tell you, I drove from Alfred, and it's about 1,000 miles, something like that, but I came to La Crosse and then drove up the Mississippi River as slow as I dared go, because it is so beautiful. So I want to tell you what a pleasure it is to be in the state and to see all that. This occasion, I will do what I've done in giving slide presentations elsewhere. That is to try and give you some insight into who I am and what I do and where I've come from and so on, which I think most of the speakers here have approached that. I hope I can give you insight into what I make and how I've gone towards what I make. But before that, the last thing I want to say in acknowledgement is that we all know that Minnesota means so much to American ceramics. I mean, it is true that Alfred, historically, with Ohio State, were the first two schools where one could major in ceramics in terms of art. So, you know, there's a historical thing there, and Minnesota has such a history and so many wonderful potters, many of whom are here, whom I've met and know. But in particular, I'm not sure that Warren is here, but if Warren is here, I have to say how proud everyone is to know Warren McKenzie. And I got to speak with Warren last night, and that was a great pleasure. Are you here, Warren? Doesn't matter. Thank you. Well, there are former students from Alfred sitting out here, and they'll recognize the village and how it looks. On the right-hand side, all of Alfred sits down in the hills, and you can kind of see little houses sticking up there. And this is a little bit closer view of the character of the village. Alfred is getting bigger, but it's still a town that maybe has, when students aren't there, maybe 1,000 people, something like that. And Alfred University has about 3,000, and the Alfred State College, which is a 2-year school also in Alfred, on the other side of the valley, has about 3,500. So all of a sudden, this little town, which has a main street, that's what you're seeing over there, that's the business district of Alfred. A few little buildings, and these are some of the old homes that used to be family homes that are now essentially student apartments. This sort of thing that doesn't make some people happy, but it gives students an opportunity. This is the way our house now looks. My wife Elsie wasn't able to come with me on this trip, but I'll come back to her part of my life shortly. This is a little view of our kitchen, and I'm showing that because I think most of you know I'm essentially a potter who makes utilitarian work, and my wife is a magnificent cook, and she uses every single pot that I make that gets to stay home. So all those jars going across the back contain all the wonderful ingredients that Elsie puts in our food. It was a great surprise to me to meet a former student and friend, John Perry, and his wife, who are here. And John, in graduate school, helped me in little ways to reconstruct this old farmhouse. So I told John he has the kind of skills that my wife wished I had about rebuilding. But anyway. So this is the farm property where we live. We have a 60-acre former farm. This is a very old slide on the left, but when the great good fortune of an NEA grant in 1983 allowed me to put in this pond and improve the studio, which is in the barn, and there's our house down there. So you kind of see the stages. And this is one of my two oldest granddaughters skating on the pond during the winter. So I don't have enough energy to take all the snow off, so I make little paths that wind through. And now you're in my studio, which is in the barn. And again, it's about time for me to make some new slides, but this is shortly after the barn was converted, again, as a result of your gifts of the NEA, to rebuild the studio. You can see on the right-hand side, I had a wood stove for the studio for a while, and we put in these big stones as a heat retention factor. But I was teaching then, and I just couldn't handle going up to the wood stove every few hours and stoking it so my clay wouldn't freeze. And so eventually I went to gas. But this is pretty much the way it looks, except it never again has looked that clean. This is the kiln that I built in 1973. It's still the kiln that I use. It's about a 60 cubic foot downdraft soft brick natural gas kiln. Has 4 shelves on the floor. This is the back setting, and that's the front setting of a fairly typical firing. Having talked with Warren last night and several other potters, I want to tell you that I'm finally about to get those wonderful, thin, lightweight shelves. So, because my shelves, which are 1 inch thick and 30 by 12, weigh about 40 pounds, and my back isn't quite up to it anymore. So that's a great, wonderful thrill for me. I'm not going to talk about Alfred at all, except to say that Charles Binns, who founded the school in 1900, was an Englishman who brought a kind of technology to America at a time when it was just beginning to be understood in reference to ceramics. So Binns was one of the early people who had both an art and science background. And he taught and promoted the school along those lines, that art and science are compatible and in fact essential to each other for the ceramic world. He came to Alfred, and the college was established at Alfred as a result of this clay company, which was only there for 10 years, but was actually quite an extensive facility making terracotta roof tiles and that sort of thing. So New York State established this state college 300 miles west of New York City because there was somewhat of a tradition there for making ceramics of some sort, and the state wanted to encourage the economic base of a ceramic industry so they could train artists and designers and engineers and so on. And so the State College is on a private campus. Alfred University is a private university. The Ceramic College is a New York State-supported part of the State University of New York system. But at the time all this happened, in 1900, if you had gone to New York City and went up the Hudson River to Albany, you would have passed easily 200 factories just like this one. But somehow they decided to go out to the wilderness of New York State to start the ceramic school. So my background, I grew up in Rochester. I grew up in a family that was a hardworking, my father worked in a foundry until World War II and after, my relatives began going to college on the GI Bill. But until then, no one in my extended family had gone to college. And then my brother was the first one in our family. Then I was ready to go to college, and at that time, 1948, my cousin, who had been in World War II, was at Alfred University in a pre-med course. And I was about to go to another college with a scholarship to play football. That's basically all I kind of did in high school was sports. But all the time, I was drawing and doing things that the kind of enlightened parents that you all are would have said, here's somebody that might go to our school. But, you know, my family didn't have that understanding, but my cousin did. So when he came up just before summer on my way to this other school and took me to see Alfred, and I couldn't believe my eyes in many ways. That is, I didn't really, I wasn't aware that you could go to college and study art. I mean, I was that naive. And when I saw students painting and doing sculpture and in particular making pots, I decided this is where I have to go. So I was able to get in kind of at the very last minute. And then I began my 4 years, and 3 or 4 things happened of profound importance to me during that time. I say 3 or 4 things. Everything was a new, exciting thing in my life. But in my freshman year, Bernard Leach came to Alfred to do a workshop. I don't have to tell you anything more than that. As a freshman, I knew absolutely nothing about pottery. I went to a big city high school, but we didn't do clay. So and of course, in preparation to his visit, the students were all given, at that time, my teacher, and the teacher then was Daniel Rhodes, and Charles Harder was the head of the school at that time. And of course, they had prepared us for this visit, giving us some background about Bernard Leach. And as I say, because I had never even seen anyone throw until I got to Alfred. So it was such an incredible experience to listen to this man and to watch him work. So that kind of got me started. And as I say, Daniel Rhodes was my teacher. There were some wonderful people at Alfred. So I was now surrounded by a kind of motivation and a direction that left a profound impact on me. At that time, at Alfred, in the art school, you could only major in ceramics. So we took painting and sculpture and design and all the foundation courses, but every student majored in ceramics. That didn't change until 1966 or something like that. So that was the whole focus of the college. So I went through that. Then in my senior year, I mean, there were all kinds of other experiences and visiting artists that came along. But in the summer between my junior and senior year, I had an opportunity to run a pottery. And I had just, at that time, we had 2 years of foundation. So I had just in my junior year begun to understand anything about clay. And I was attracted to the wheel, and I concentrated on that the best I could. But here was this opportunity to run a small pottery up in the Adirondack Mountains of New York State. If any of you know New York State, we do have mountains up in the north land. And So I couldn't have been more excited and thrilled about this possibility. Now, every possibility has drawbacks. What you're looking at is Santa's workshop. And I was the potter in Santa's workshop. And of course, if you work for Santa Claus, you have to be an elf. So we wore elf costumes. So there I am with my arm around Santa Claus and at the North Pole, which was a frozen, refrigerated column of ice that was the picture spot. And then I had little elves who were the people who sold the pots that I made in my little house. And that's one of my little elves there. Well, it's hard for me to explain this situation, except it was the most wonderful experience I had had up to date, because I stood at a potter's wheel and threw every day, 8 hours a day, for 3.5 months. And I did. It was a complete little pot shop, so I had a little electric kiln, I had a little spray booth, I made pots. And it was tremendous. It gave me the sense of confidence that, yes, I could make that clay move, and I could do that sort of thing. And it was, of course, remember that I first saw people, I learned to throw a little bit off the hump, as we call it, at the top, and cut off these bowls at Santa's workshop. Those were the souvenir pieces. So I got to the point where I was making 50 or 60 of those every hour, and then putting slip in and scratching in Santa's workshop and making little drawings, graffito drawings of reindeer, that sort of thing. So I spent a lot of time doing that, but I was still learning. And when I went back to my senior year, I was confident. I knew that at least I could throw. And Alfred's always been a competitive place, and there were very good throwers. There was a man in my class who is now a full-time potter in North Carolina, in Blowing Rock, North Carolina, Herb Cohen. And Herb Cohen was in New York City, in the Lower East Side, when New York City built low-cost housing. His family lived there, and when he was something like 7 or 8 years old, he went to a community center in Manhattan and was on the potter's wheel at that age. And so by the time he came to Alfred as an 18-year-old, he could throw better than anybody in the college, including the grad students and so on. So there was that kind of thing. So I felt, well, at least I can sort of, come back and make pots. And I want to tell you, and this was the real lesson of this whole experience, that it was an extraordinarily frustrating year for me, because what I had were tricky fingers and no notion of what to make. No idea of what kind of pots I had made all these things. I could make things, but I couldn't make anything with some sense of where I was going and what, it was like I was so focused on learning the skill. And I think that came somewhat of my background in sports, where you learn quickly that if you're going to be good, you have to practice. And, you get better. So I understood that. I also played music. I played trombone in school. And again, there was discipline in practice. So I understood those two things. You practice, and the discipline keeps you practicing, and you get better. But what I was missing was, what do you make? I mean, how do you get going? How do you go somewhere? I mean, I could look at a book and make a Sung Dynasty pot, that kind of thing. I mean, take that with a grain of salt. Well, then another thing happened in my senior year. So I was back there with this technique and this frustration, and Marguerite Wildenhain came to Alfred for 2 weeks. And Dan Rhodes brought Marguerite to Alfred, and we worked with her for 2 weeks as our teacher. And that was an extraordinary experience. I had never, Dan Rhodes was a brilliant teacher. I felt, for me, no teacher is great for everybody. I think after 40 years of teaching, I think I learned that. You know, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But for me, Dan Rhodes was brilliant. But Dan Rhodes was not an accomplished thrower. And to have Marguerite Wildenhain come to school and start throwing was an absolutely awesome experience. She was an incredible thrower. She had gone through a long apprenticeship in the Bauhaus and so on, and she was perhaps one of the first women to be a full-time studio potter in America. That's an exaggeration, but she was very early on in California running and supporting herself as a potter. She had this passion, she had this, she had the kind of charisma and dynamic force that I think people like Frank Lloyd Wright and people like that have on young people. You know, you just feel riveted. And she brought that to me. There I am at my stand-up wheel. This is 1951 you're looking at. There was a blacksmith there, by the way. And there's Marguerite in 1952. That wheel she's throwing on is a copy of her wheel, which was built by Hui Ka Kwong, who was Marguerite's first apprentice in California, and he was at Alfred getting his MFA when Marguerite came. So she was throwing on his wheel. It's a wooden European wheel, kick wheel, of course, with a wooden head. Everything was thrown on the wooden head. In this picture on the left, that blue shirt guy standing there is Daniel Rhodes, and the other two are students. And in the right-hand slide, that woman to the right of Marguerite is Marion Fosdick, who was a sculpture and clay teacher at Alfred since the early 1900s. So she was one of the first faculty members that Binns brought to Alfred. But, you know, to see Marguerite pick up a plate that looked like a Salvador Dali watch and bring it over and drop it, and the thing, you know, spun into this perfect centered thing. You know, there was those kinds of skills were so I first saw Bernard Leach. I had wonderful teachers and fellow students at Alfred. I had this experience at Santa's workshop. And then I had this meeting with Marguerite, and all of these things, and the story I'm trying to tell you is how one gets directed towards something. And these people and these experiences were so crucial to me in that regard. And what I would like to say next is that, so I left school and started a studio and began making pots. But instead of that, I was drafted into the Army for 2 years. So that kind of delayed things. But eventually, I came back and met Elsie, and that's my wife Elsie, and when I was in graduate school, just getting ready, and there's no way I can go through these old slides without occasionally seeing a cigarette in my hand, but I don't smoke anymore. I stopped 30 years ago, So there we were, starting our life together. Elsie has been tremendously important in my life in so many ways, and in particular, her understanding that I had to be in the studio working. And we have 4 children, and Elsie, who is professionally a nurse, and then became professional in terms of sewing and knitting and taking care of all of us, and giving me in particular the guilt-free opportunity to go in the studio and do my work. It was crucial to me, and it was crucial to my development. So that was one of those lucky things that can happen in your life. This is a shot of the kill room at Alfred. Many of you will recognize it, sitting here. This is now called Harder Hall, after Charles Harder. This was not the school that I went to. This is now the College of Ceramics at Alfred. So I'm taking the great risk maybe of showing you pots I made in graduate school. This is 1950, I always get dates wrong, 1954 to 56. Those are my graduate years at Alfred. And those were some of the pots I was making. Again, I can only say that it's fortunate if you can relate to a teacher that was important to you. And Dan Rose was that for me. He was that way for his eye, he was a very intelligent man who had a huge scope of knowledge about the history of ceramics and a wonderful eye. So I worked in earthenware and porcelain and stoneware, and we did raku. We had a wood-fired kiln. I mean, we had a good experience. And so in graduate school, I made a variety of things and then had the incredible good luck of discovering a glaze. I actually made a glaze. And in fact, you had to. In those days, we were taught glaze and clay technology by an engineer, Clarence Merritt. And you had to develop glazes. And I developed this glaze, which became known as Cushing matte. And I began using it on everything I made one way or another. These are some things that are floating in a lily pond over here. And this is sort of the direction I was headed in. This is graduate school. After those 2 years, I was talking to Charles Harder one day and trying to get a fix on my direction. I was able to go to graduate school through the GI Bill. It was another one of those wonderful programs that in a way shaped America, I think, at a particular time. And yet I had no money beyond that and no possibility of starting a studio. It simply couldn't do it. And I was talking to Charles Harder about this, and he said to me, well, as you think back, what are the things that are most important to you over the past few years, or something like that? And it was easy for me to answer that because there was no doubt about it. It was that my life opened up because I went to a school where teachers cared about students and teachers gave you something. And I said, well, that was the most important thing in my life. And he said, and he just sort of sat there and smiled and just kept looking at me. And it finally got through because he was saying, well, why don't you think about teaching? Because if you have that reaction to what happened in your life, then you may have that opportunity to bring that to someone else. So yes, it began to make sense. And I did eventually, as I left Alfred, finishing graduate school, I had a job at the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana, and that was my first teaching job. And during that year, 1956, a position opened at Alfred, which I applied for and got. So I turned back around and drove east again, back to Alfred, and there we remain. Now, many of you will understand in the years of from 52 on, there was another incredible phenomena going on in this country, and of course that was the Archie Bray Foundation, and that was the influence that began with Peter Volkus and Rudy Adio, and the whole implication of the Archie Bray Foundation, and the incredible energy and force that Peter Volkus brought to ceramics. And I don't think you could have been a student then and not in some way caught some of that energy and some of that opportunity. And what it meant to me, now you're looking at pieces that I began making when I came back to Alfred in 1957 and began doing my personal work and began that journey of trying to find a voice, trying to find who I was, who I really was. I had acquired a lot of knowledge and a lot of skills and a lot of, fortunately, more understanding about what one tries to make. But I was also caught by the kind of energy thing. It's hard to verbalize, but many of you know what I mean. So, for instance, to throw a cylinder, which we all of us potters do, and then simply cutting it and squeezing it together was a huge step to me, in a sense. I mean, it was just an adventure of, gee, look what happens. You know, you squeeze it together, and I wasn't aware of anybody doing that. That has nothing to do with it. It's only that when you discover something yourself that happens in your work, it begins to take on a significance. And the sense of freedom, in a way. Now, nobody at Alfred ever said, don't make this or don't make that. But for some reason, not for some reason, there wasn't the atmosphere then to experiment more with clay, to push the process a little further in a little way. So anyway, I began making forms with that notion of, just that simple notion of flattening the cylinder, and therefore seeing forms in a different way. So these are pieces that I did during those years, the late 50s. As you can see, I did have a camera, but I never learned how to make great slides. And in fact, I just waited for sunny days and put the pots outside somewhere. And I still more or less do that, but I've gotten a little bit better, or on the kitchen table in this case. These are pots made 58, 59, 60. I'm not going to do a complete chronological show for you today. I am only in this early stage, and then we're going to look at it in a different way. But I wanted you to see some of the work that was, for me, quite adventuresome and quite different from the solid kind of understanding I had of utilitarian pottery. Alfred, I didn't say this, but Alfred was very strong. Charles Harder was an advocate of the Bauhaus philosophy, which was in part that industry, in fact, can make beautiful things for people that can be afforded. Now, this was a great controversy with Bernard Leach, and in fact, for those of you who have an art history kind of interest, there in the archives at Alfred are a series of letters between Bernard Leach and Charles Harder discussing and arguing this very point of, can the machine make something, you know, and so on. You all know that argument, that discussion. Well, that was going on, but I came through a certain sense of form as a designer. That is, we did make jiggered forms. We did drain casts and solid casts. We were prepared to go into industry as a designer, and some of my classmates did that. And some took the path of pottery, but we were given those skills and so on. And, you know, we knew how to think about how to make a handle that fits your hand and the importance of functional or utilitarian considerations. But for me also, I had this longing to push things a little bit differently. And now again we come to another interesting part of ceramics for me. In 1966, I think it was, when John Perry and Bob Schmitz were graduate students at Alfred, the three of us built a wood kiln at my studio. And you're looking at the wood kiln over there, which was a catenary arch, firebox on both sides between the wall and the bag wall. And we had a notion that we would use it as an oil-fired kiln sometimes too, but that never happened. And so we would stoke both sides, fireboxes on both sides, and get the effect of snow, that is, the ash going up across the arch and filtering down on pots in that manner. So John and Bob worked with this kiln with me for a year anyway, and then they went off to their next step in their lives, and I continued firing the wood kiln for 2 or 3, maybe 4 years. The effect it had on me personally was to take my work away from function. That is, for me, the wood kiln, the kind of results I got in my wood kiln did not satisfy the sense I had of what a utilitarian pot should have in terms of touch and feel and use and the inviting textural qualities and so on. For me, the wood kiln was more interesting in making what we now call vessels, the terminology of today. So I had a gallery on Cape Cod in Wellfleet during these years, and this was an exhibition I had there of pots, all pots fired in my wood kiln. These were some of the pots that I made for the wood kiln, remembering the effect of the wood ash kind of filtering down. It wasn't like the anagama that is like a blast furnace, pushing through the kiln. This was just a kind of gentle flame carrying ash up and down on the pots. So I kind of headed in that direction with my work. And then some thrown and hand-built pieces together. There's a couple of those pots. As I say, we had a wood kiln at Alfred as an undergraduate and as a graduate in my own career, so I was familiar with wood. But naturally, when you work with it yourself and getting the flashing and all that kind of thing was very exciting to me at that time. Couple more. Then began for me perhaps an idea that I could feel came from me. We have all so many influences, and I'm going to be talking more about that shortly, but I wanted to begin this series as what I would say in a sense the beginning of my personal work, or an idea that I developed, for my work. And the very first example of which is the pot on the right, which was in that show at the gallery on Cape Cod. That was the first time it ever occurred to me or happened that I began to take the rim of the pot and turn it back into itself. Just a simple gesture. It is not, of course, had been done in Japan, had been done in Korea. This was not something I invented, but it didn't mean anything to me until it did mean something to me. That's a great statement, isn't it? And here's why. That's the only one that I made that did not end up being a covered jar. The insight that it gave me when I made that first pot. Oh, I have a little laser thing here. I love to use it. That right there. Well, it suddenly occurred to me. You can have these insights that could be earth-shattering to you personally because they came out of your invention and be very simple, obvious sort of thing. But until you see it, it isn't important. And what I saw was that every pot I've ever made up to this point always ended up pointing up. Just that simple fact. Now the rim of the pot was pointing back down. And that suddenly connected in my mind to the idea of a covered jar, because for me a covered jar is about what's inside. And so visually, this type of form began to appeal to me in that it's saying, look down here. There it is. That's what's inside. It had that implication to me. So I began making pots like this. And this is in the late 60s when this particular, actually just after the wood kiln, I By the late 60s, I went back to firing gas-fired reduction, which is how I still fire, and which has essentially been the way my work has gone ever since. So I played with that relationship in every way I could think of. I was, you know, when you have an idea that you are interested in, you pursue it, and it takes you places. And so these are pieces made in the late 60s and early 70s, and were the character, a lot of the character of my work at that time came from and represented for me something that I finally felt I had to pull out of myself. And it wasn't so much a result of the influences of wonderful potters and teachers and friends and museums and all the things that we all get to see and think about, which influence us. But that time when you begin to pull something in your work that you can say is, or feel is something you really pulled out of your own heart, then that takes on a different implication. You know, you have to understand that you can't make pots for 40 or 50 years and not have made thousands of pots. And you can be sure I'm not going to show you thousands of slides today. So everything you see are just little ones I've picked out of a great many made. The one on the right was in an exhibition that some of you remember in 1969 or 70 called Objects USA. And it was, I thought, quite an important exhibition at that time, because it represented a sort of cross-section of what American ceramics were going through at that date. And that exhibition traveled all over the country and Europe, and so it was an exhibition that seemed to me showed, it was like saying, okay, it's 1970, I keep hitting, 1970, this is American ceramics in a way. Well, that was my part in that show on the right. This is something I began doing and still do today, and I think every potter who ever made a cover jar surely has made more than one lid for the same jar. Because you're trying to work, I mean, it's one of the few times in form where you can try one thing and see if it works, and then try another thing and see which one you like, and so on. You know, you can't take a handle off a pitcher and put a different handle on, but you can take the lid off. So I began playing with that because it was, first, as I say, it was simply to visually solve the problem. But then, for me, what became interesting to me was to take the same form, of course it's the same jar, and to see how the form is transformed by the relationship of the lid. And it also struck me as an opportunity, if one owned a pot, to put one lid on for a while, and then put another lid on for a while. And I was quite taken by that possibility. But the galleries were not taken by that possibility. So I had to stop doing that. But so I kept the way you do with a particular idea or a particular concept, I think most of us do, is to take it through as many variations as you can think of, trying to uncover new insights as you go. You're not repeating yourself, you don't make the same pot every time, but you try to catch characteristics of this one and characteristics and forms and ideas and so on, and develop that. One thing I want to throw out here too, that many of you know, that one of the responsibilities that became mine at Alfred was to teach the clay and glaze course that all Alfred students take. That was a course that Charles Binns taught, that Charles Harder taught, that Dan Rhodes taught, before that Clarence Merritt, an engineer, and then of course you know Dan Rhodes' book, Clay and Glazes for the Potter, and it became my course ultimately. So you all know, many of you are teachers here, and you know that when you teach something, that's when you really start to learn it. You know, so most of the glazes you'll see in my work are glazes that of my development. And I carried on the tradition that meant a great deal to me, which was in Alfred, all those teachers I mentioned and everyone gradually got the feeling that glazes were everybody's property, no matter who developed it. And of course, as a teacher, naturally, everything that I worked with, I gave to students. And because you're teaching a class where 20 to 30 people sometimes are taking a lab course in glazes, you can set up a glaze project. You know, let's just say everybody does 10 tests, and you have 30 people doing 10 tests. So all of a sudden, the lab is filled with glaze tests. And naturally, the teacher learns the most from that, right? I mean, you know, you're standing there looking at them all the time. So that was part of what I did at Alfred, and so it became such an interesting thing to me to do that. So most everything you're going to see here are glazes that I developed over the years. This was my studio before the NEA grant. Let me put it that way. And I still had a good space, but it got bigger. This is preparing for an exhibition I had in Dallas, Texas in 1982 or 3. And you can see the evolution of some of these jars as the years went by. I worked with them, not exclusively, of course, but I worked with them pretty much through the 70s and into the early 1980s. And you can see what I tried to do with them. I draw constantly when I work, and you can see in the back some drawings that were, I don't draw the pot in detail that I'm trying to make. I use drawing as a way to quickly run through some ideas and then think about it, look at them, and then begin work. Not looking at the drawing, but trying to work with what I have learned from the drawing. So that's how that goes. These are 2 pots that were in that show in Texas that I'm fond of. And this was, I won't say a culmination, but in a sense, this group were pieces made for an exhibition curated by Garth Clark that Warren Mackenzie was in, called American Masters, I think was the title, which is interesting considering why I'm here today in a way. But that Garth Clark made that exhibition into a book. And these were the 6 pieces that I made for that exhibition before they were fired. And you can see here one of them finished. This is significant to me in several ways. It was making these pieces that I began the process of destroying my wrist, and I've since had to have carpal tunnel surgery and all that sort of thing. But it was, you know, handling. I made all these always in one piece at this point, and anyway, you know, but they were kind of. I had pushed this direction. These are 2 more of that group. And it was also at this point where another realization came to me. And that was, I mean, first of all, I was teaching full time. I never stopped doing my own work, of course, but teaching full time in a school that required a lot of energy if you were doing your job properly. And so I was exhibiting, and this type of piece of mine became something that people wanted. And the galleries that I was dealing with began asking for these pieces. And then it reached a point where I realized, wait a minute, this has got to stop. First of all, I wasn't making my living as a potter, I was making my living as a teacher. Making pots was the necessary thing for me to do to support my whole life and my income, you know, teaching. So I didn't want to be in the position of just making things that I could just go and sell. There's nothing wrong with that, and you always need money, and we had 4 children and so on, but I began to see that I was repeating myself, not making the same form, but this whole idea began to just, for me, in an ironic sort of way, the popularity that they were receiving was too easy. It was just too easy. When I sat down, it was easy to make these, and you know, on the one hand you think, well, that's wonderful. I mean, isn't that what we strive for, you know, to have it be easy to do your work, but not easy in the sense that the intellectual challenge or the aesthetic challenge was not strong enough for me. So I completely stopped making these forms. I just stopped. And I'll come back to that in a minute, in a few minutes, I should say. Now, one of the things that we've also been asked to do a little bit in the very tactful and quiet way that Emily has, for those of us who get this wonderful opportunity, to respond somewhat, if we can, to certain things about our growth and development and so on. And one of those is obviously your influences and your sources, and I'm going to spend a little time now talking about that. And I want to say, I've already mentioned Marguerite. This is still another picture of her throwing. But the really important people, when I came back to teach at Alfred, these were my colleagues. Ted Randall, Dan Rhodes, William Perry, Robert Turner. Robert Turner, who just died at 92 a month ago. Bill Perry died shortly before that. Dan Rhodes died actually giving a workshop. You know, began the process of his dying, and Ted Randall's also gone. So, you know, I think to myself, when I began teaching in 1957 at Alfred, these were my colleagues, and I was the young guy, right? You know, that stage in your teaching career, you're the new young guy. And when I retired in 1997, of course, it was completely the opposite, right? I was the old guy, and Ann Currier and Wayne Higbee and John Gill and Andrea Gill, and now Linda Sikora, who's my replacement, who I'm absolutely thrilled about because she's a wonderful potter. They're the new faculty, you know, and I look at this slide. Actually, I should tell you that that's Mutsuo Yanagihara, who's a wonderful potter from Kyoto, who taught at Alfred 1 year, actually replacing Dan Rhodes. When Dan Rhodes was in Tamba writing his book on Tamba, Mutsuo came to teach in his place at Alfred. So we became friends, and I have since, in visits to Japan, stayed with him and so on. And we're there giving a critique to Kent DeWalt, who's right here. He was a grad student. And we're standing there just as we moved into Harder Hall. That's where that took place. But I'm showing it because we had, as a group, we had our individual differences, of course, but we had a sense of community and shared philosophical positions that made, you know, that was a wonderful point in my life to work with people like that, whom I admire tremendously, and all contributed so much to my own understanding. And here's the other thing that I have mentioned now, that famous photograph at Archie Bray. That I just absolutely love that picture, showing Yanagi, starting at the left, Yanagi, Bernard Leach, Rudy Audio, Pete Volkus, and Hamada. I mean, what more could you ask? You know, and that was that wonderful tour that Leach and Hamada made across America, and that was at Archie Bray. And when Pete at that point, was still making his beautiful traditional stoneware functional pots. And then, of course, Pete, as he later got into his work and into the kind of work that we identify most with him, taken at a demonstration at Alfred sometime in the 70s. I lose track of dates, so if anybody here, some of the former students here may have been here when Pete was there, he did 3 demonstrations at Alfred over the years, and this was one of them. But this is what I meant to say to you earlier, that again, my work has nothing to do with Pete Volkow's work, and it never did. But what it did for me was the sense of you have to have lived during the 50s and sense that there was this new surge of something going on in clay that just sort of gave a certain kind of life that I think most of us felt at that time. So I have to say, that was the influence on me. It was just this sense of new, fresh work with energy and passion going on that gives everybody something. And the history of ceramics, of course, it's hard for me to think of anyone who isn't in some way influenced by the wonderful pottery that's been made in the history of ceramics. And these are a couple of my most favorite pots. You know, we all have certain connections to things. This is, of course, a Mimbrace Native American piece that just astounds me. I can't ever get tired of looking at that bowl. It just, I don't know if some of you perhaps heard Aisha Peltz give her slide presentation at the Northern Clay Center this morning, in which she showed that famous photograph of a drop of water, or a drop of milk splashing in a puddle, and this crown develops. You know that photograph, don't you? You know, what I see here is a pebble dropped in the water, and it just rippling out to the sides. It's just magnificent sense of composition in a bowl. Just amazes me. The one on the right is a Persian bowl, low fire earthenware with black slip and that beautiful sodium copper, lovely turquoise that was so characteristic of the Middle East. And it's a pot that I always tried to show to students who, as a prime example of what happens with decoration, what can happen. Am I still coming out with my microphone? You know, where you take a motif, and where the form is small, the motif is small, and then it expands as you move to the rim. And here's this glorious, to me, example of that happening. That kind of thing, you know, the beauty of something like that for me has been a tremendous influence. Of course, in the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto, they've changed their display now, but way back they had virtually everything, kind of like the Victoria Albert, where the whole collection is out. There's not much in storage. And they had done the same thing, this Sung Dynasty bowl with the clay mold, and of course it was thrown over the clay mold, and there you have that beautiful use of celadon that we all know so well out of Chinese ceramics. And this Han Dynasty jar with the wood ash on the shoulder and so on, these are pieces that are so, this one is not so much the piece as simply what it represents. I mean, after all, in the Song Dynasty, they made those by the thousands. You know, that was the production ware. But look at it, you know. This was an eye-opener to me until I got to England on the Fulbright and got to see some of the collections in England. I had never really seen Roman pottery like this. And this really, I was so impressed because it was the same kind of things I was trying to do. That is, putting slurry on a pot and pulling your fingers through it, you know, the kind of thing that was done on the right. Or this, what I what I call the Roman Giorgior pot. Um, I mean, potters did things with clay. Once you could use the wheel, that nobody here was going to invent that somebody hadn't done before them somewhere down the line, at least technically. And so I look at things like this with great admiration. This, of course, the medieval jug to any, I think any utilitarian potter must come through as some sort of landmark of elegance, of tremendous, that negative space in the handle, that whole sense of this form that's just rising like a medieval church. I mean, like a Gothic, just elegant, wonderful pieces. This was a Greek casserole, and it made an impression on me that stayed hidden for many, many years. And if you know my work, you know what I'm driving at here. I think maybe I've somehow gotten these out of phase. I want to try something here for a second. No, that's not where I want to go. Whoops, wait a minute. Not even that's where I want to go. Wait. No? Okay, well, at any rate, I had never seen that technique of making the donut handle, or bagel if you prefer, whatever. They're hollow, and I looked at that and I took this slide in the British Museum, and that year I took hundreds of slides traveling around England on my Fulbright thing. So I came back home and filled up drawers with these slides, and some of them just stayed there for years and years. But I began making cover jars with using that thing, that round thing, as have many others, I have to assume that sitting back in me somewhere was the memory of this piece that then eventually came to my work. Something isn't quite right here. I'm sorry. That's where I want to be. So now I'm going back one step again. Okay, I wanted those two to be together. There are wonderful examples of these medieval jugs in collections all over England, and of course in the Nelson Gallery in Kansas City, among other places, and I haven't had a chance to look here. So do we have some here in this museum? Do we? Oh, wonderful. I love them. Okay, well, sources again. That's an important one for me. We all benefit. We all, when I'm talking to people in the deep south of the United States, I can say, well, one thing you don't have is the autumn. But we have the autumn, and we have the change of color, which is a wonderful reason to live in the north in this country. Because for me anyway, the color change in autumn is a deeply emotional and important effect on me, and in the way I see color and what I feel about nature. And I have tried to develop glazes that have some of that character. That's just a close-up of a piece. Not, of course, trying to imitate it, just trying to see if I can get that warmth and that richness. That's been important to me. This is in the woods behind my house. There, of course, is the round handle on a cover jar. It's still not the one I want. I'm sorry. Wait. What is going on here? Well, let's see. Well, while we're at this, these are acorns, of course, and the acorn looked at closely in a close-up lens like this became very important to me as one of the nature references that I use in my work, and you'll see others, of course. This one in particular, I love the shift in texture from one part to the other part. And it also seemed to be so much in keeping with what I was already discovering about the rolled over edge and so on, you know. So they are something that I've worked with also in terms of color. I can look at this and see color possibilities, and I have done in glazes. You know, you look at something like that, and you see, 1% chrome in an MgO glaze. You know, you know what I mean? That kind of thing. Well, there's the acorn jar that should have been with the acorns, but. I'm out of sync, and I don't quite know why this is happening. Well, that's close enough. These two I want together. I also look, of course, at these squash-like things, and this sense of. I can't look at this piece on the left without seeing it as a cover jar. I mean, it's exactly what I wanted to make, you know. So I've tried to use things like that in my work. Another thing that expresses to me a sense of something inside pushing out, and I like to try and get those characteristics in my forms in terms of volume and expansion of inside. Now I want to go to something else that I think is certainly crucial to me, and at least as I look at people's work in clay, I think I see one of the very dominant concepts that we deal with is process and material. That is the ideas that grow out of your insight and understanding about process and about materials. Process, of course, throwing, hand building, whatever, that is making objects, and materials, understanding the clays and glazes and colors and potentials that are possible in your work. And I want to show you some examples of process in nature that influence me. I look at and think about these things. John might remember this, perhaps no one else, but in Alfred, this is in the valley, right across where our farm is, there was an artesian well up in a hill that was piped down, and all through the winter, the water would squirt out of this pipe and shower all the bushes and everything around it, and it would create these incredible ice sculptures, these are three of my children when they were children. They used to climb around in these things, and I made all these fantasies about the Ice King who lived inside the Ice Palace, that only the youngest would buy, of course. But I looked at this all the time, and what you're seeing is the process of water striking forms and freezing, and creating these incredible images. And it was just, I never got tired of looking at this and thinking about it, and trying to utilize some of that notion, not, of course, in any literal way, but it was an important thing to me. And I do feel that much of the ceramics that I see in this world are really a reflection of how different artists have managed that concept of how to bring together the processes that we're so familiar with and the materials that we deal with. This is an example of that. For me, this is Mutsu Yanagihara, the Japanese potter, who still works quite strongly in luster glazes and so on. But, you know, there was a period in American ceramics where luster was a fashion, which has happened all the time in this country. We had the stoneware, we had the salt glaze, we had the soda salt, we had the wood, we had the anagama, and these are all wonderful, expressive ways to work in clay, but to some extent can become fashions to some people who only see it in a more superficial sense. That doesn't matter. If you get excitement from it, you do it. I look at Julia Galloway's wonderful use of luster in places. I mean, there's a use that's so fresh, even though it's related to the past. Well, what I see in Mutsu's work, for instance, putting whoops, that's the wrong one. right? Putting a platinum luster here so that what you see is a reflection going into the platinum, so he carries your eye through the piece by reflection. You see it here. Okay, this is this whole thing bouncing up and hitting here. Well, that's material and process, right? It's understanding what the characteristics of a certain type of glaze are and making it work in some way with whatever forms you want to take it. We're back to a Roman pot again. I mean, who sitting here in this room who uses the wheel hasn't tried this? You know, some way or other, including me. I mean, I use it all the time, one way or another. The idea of pushing the soft clay and manipulating it somehow with your fingers. Material and process again to me. Now these, of course, I'm just glibly tossing out those words. What matters is how you bring that to specific terms of how it manifests itself in a certain type of form. We're familiar with this kind of thing. These Rosangian pieces, by the way, was another visitor to Alfred when I was a student, who made these trays by soaking straw in salt solutions and then firing one tray on top of the other and getting a pattern both on the inside and the outside. Another example to me. Or the whole idea of a primitive or bonfire type firing in which pieces can be shoved down and part of them are getting constant reduction and part oxidation. So you get black and red, the clay going from reduction to oxidation. So another part of this understanding that you can then fashion, right? You can make things happen knowing that process and that material. I must say, I never get tired of looking at that slide, which I took just quite by luck in Hawaii. It's just there. It's really there. I was just walking across this bridge, and I look up, and there it is. And of course, Hawaii is the home of Toshiko Takeizu, and these are early pieces of her work. And don't you see the atmospheric sense of how color floats into the work, and yet it also helps if you know that if you have a slip with chrome in it and you use a tin glaze, you're going to get pink, right? You're going to get this color, and it spreads into the piece like atmosphere. And you know, I've never talked to Toshiko about this, but it's certainly, when I see Hawaii and when I saw these early pieces of hers, I felt, wow, there's material and process. I draw constantly. I don't draw for exhibition's sake. I draw for my sake. I learn constantly from drawing. I draw from real objects sometimes just not. So that's an important source and influence to me. And I have to tell you about that salt glaze jug, because it was made in Rochester, New York, very close to Alfred and where I grew up. And it was in my grandmother's house. And it's a butter churn, actually. The top piece isn't there. Salt glaze made by Berger, which is one of the salt glaze manufacturers that was in Rochester. But my relationship to this was, in my grandmother's house, she had a large porch. And on that porch, which was screened in, you would come in the porch and then into the house. And on hot summer days, this was an umbrella stand for her. She had this out on the porch with umbrellas in it. And on a hot summer's day, I can remember going into that porch and sitting down next to that pot and putting my cheek against that salt glaze texture, and it was cool, and there was that sensation of the orange peel of a salt glaze. I had such an emotional connection to that pot, that eventually became mine in inheritance, you know. And I think to myself, in the most perhaps exaggerated way, could that have made me a potter? I don't know, but it's the kind of connection I love, and that pot is very dear to me, and it sits in my studio today. And one of my, I told you the story of stopping the idea of the rolled over jar. But the next question is, now what do I make? You know, and I'm saying, of course, throughout my work, always, I have made and I continue to make utilitarian pots. That never stops. What I hope for is that they get better, and they're always a challenge. They're the same challenge to me as it is to make anything else. But I also make other things, and I was looking for ways to deal with that, and I finally came to the architectural column. So I began doing a series of work around that idea, that simple idea. Here is a picture of a column, and it was the elements of the column that I finally came to, and really quite a different feeling for me than the jars that I've talked about, because these were tall, heavy, stone-like. Those were some of the qualities I was after, and the relationships between elements like this and, of course, the various treatments that are possible with a column. So I did pursue that, and that became the next element in my work that I stayed with and still do one way or another. You'll see in the very end when we get to that. So these are some in the studio, unfired, and some that were finished. I want to show you there is my wife Elsie and our son Eric and one daughter Nancy and myself at an exhibition that Eric and I had together in Washington. There was a gallery there for a while called the Farrell Collection on Connecticut Avenue. And at that time my son was painting. So it was a combination of his paintings and my pots. And it just happens that, oh, here I thought that slide was that pot, but I see that it isn't. Doesn't matter. Anyway, they were examples of that column jar. Now my son Eric is a potter, I'm happy to say. This was one of the rare commissions that I've done over the years. This was for a building in Dallas, Texas, and they wanted, well, they sent me drawings and so on, and this is all kind of marble, you know, going back to this fountain. This is actually a fountain down here, and they wanted vessels to be put in that setting. Since I was working on the column jar idea, these are the pieces that I ended up with. But what, in all this negotiation and talk with the architects, what no one ever told me was exactly how they were going to be. I knew how they were going to be mounted, but I didn't know that they were going to use this awful white grout in between the bricks, in between the tiles. So I'm not happy with that, but nevertheless, that was one of the uses of this column jar idea. In the year 2000, I was at the University of Wolverhampton, back in England, as an artist in residence. They gave me a studio and I could just work. And that was important to me because I knew that in that school, I would essentially be working with electric kilns. And while, of course, as a student and at other times, I have an electric kiln, but most of my work, of course, comes from my gas reduction kiln. So I developed some new glazes when I went to England, knowing that I would be firing electric kilns, although they did have a reduction kiln there, and I did do some reduction firings. But anyway, this piece on the left was one of the pieces I made in England. I'll show you a couple more. This was another direction I pursued and I'm trying to show you, and I haven't said this in so many words yet, but I have always tried in my work to follow different directions, to follow challenges that put me somewhere in unfamiliar ground, where I had to try and resolve something. And as I say, I personally feel that as a teacher, that was absolutely essential. Once again, I did not have to depend on selling my work to make a living. So I felt that my responsibility was to uncover insights for myself that I could bring to myself and to my students somehow or other. So I've always gone off in directions, some of which developed well and some not. This was one that I never resolved completely, but they were shard, I call my shard platters, in that I made all these pieces, and I would bisque fire everything, pieces like this, and then I would place them somewhat like a collage and glaze them, and they would fuse together in the firing. So they weren't in position until the glaze actually melted and they went together. And I've done a whole series like this, and I've come back to it a couple times, but it has never quite worked for me. So it's one of those things that I felt interesting and I learned from, and it's still somewhere in my mind, and I might still come back to it, I'm not sure. But you can see, you can get a sense of what I was trying to do. Then I've done a series of pieces making these large pictures that again was an exaggeration of what I would think of as a picture, but somehow hoping that the exaggeration in a way calls you back to the whole notion of a picture. That is, a container in which some kind of liquid sits and that you pick up, that you pour from, and you could pour from one of these. They all work, but you have to be pretty strong. I can tell you that, because they're not light. Then I took the same kind of idea in the vase form, and again took it through an extensive series. I mean, all of these things were pursued in a great many pieces. That was a piece I made in England. The one I developed one of the high calcium so-called fake ash glazes that I used in the electric kilns. So that pot on the right was fired in the electric kiln. These are some other vase forms of mine. I, for the first time, by the way, used this idea on a vase. I hadn't done that before. I had only used it in terms of the covered jar. This was a significant time. I had, for the first time in my teaching, in 1990, I had a year's sabbatical, or leave of absence. I'd had a half-year sabbaticals before, but for those of you who are teaching, you know what I mean when I say that what you can accomplish in a full year as against a semester is really incredibly different. A semester goes just like that somehow or other. But having this year off, I got a tremendous amount of work done. And this was the first time that I returned to the rolled over jars that I left back in 1983. And I came back to them because I had a new take on them. This is an example. Well, these all are in a way. I had a different sort of takeoff from the base, and that was enough of a change that I began to think of the forms in a quite different way. So now I was willing to come back to that idea, and I made them all in two pieces instead of one, so that changed the way I thought about the forms and the way the forms related to each other. So this was a body of work, and certainly not the whole year, but this was a body of work that came. Now you're seeing my glazing table. I use as many as 30 different glazes, and I use constant mixings of one over the other, under the other. I use them in a huge number of ways, but that's that part of my studio. So these are some of these jars now thought of in a different way than the idea first came. Okay, now I'm going to show you some utilitarian pots. These are platters, serving platters, in which I like to make and use, and that we use, and hopefully others use. They're big and they're not going to go on your little table, but there's a place for them in the right setting for things to be served. Some other ones. I know that. Well, okay. A little phenomena on the right-hand side that that these are some of the little insights that are so crucial in your creative work. That is, it seems to me that the thing which is most exhausting, to me at any rate, about making pots is not the physical work. It's the necessity to keep your mind open for everything that you see as you're doing it. These little insights that happen when you're doing a certain thing and suddenly this happens and you think, oh. And if you're just sort of laying back, chewing gum, listening to the radio, you're going to miss those insights, and they're so crucial. So it seems to me that staying awake and alive to the things that happen as you work, and to the willingness to actually change directions when you think you've got something going the way you want it, and then some little thing happens and you think, oh my goodness, I've got to start this idea over because now I can take it this way or that way. And if any of you read one of my favorite authors, who is Annie Dillard, there's a book she's written called The Writing Life. And if you want to get some insights about the creative effort, read that book. It's terribly important to me. And she describes exactly what I've just described in terms of writing. That is, you get going on a certain idea and you write page after page, and then you get to a certain paragraph, and then the use of a certain word suddenly turns your head around. And she said, now you've got to throw it all out and start again, because now you have a better idea for how to get that concept across, and so on. And I find that happens to us, certainly to me, and I've experienced it over and over. So when you know your glazes well enough, so that in the right application, the same glaze produces this color because it's thicker, and it's like suddenly you shine a spotlight across the pot. It sort of lights up the piece. I love trying to use elements like that in my work, and I think the more you understand your materials, the more you can make things happen. This, of course, is I'm not giving you as I said, I'm not talking about time anymore. I will just in this case, because this was made a couple months ago, and this was made in the 70s. This is a salt glaze pitcher, and this is a glaze, a fairly new glaze that I'm using now that without fail, wherever it's thicker, it goes black and shiny, and where it's thinner, it stays that way. So you know that that's going to happen, and that's going to happen, and so on. So it sort of directs your work when you know those things will do that for you. This is a wine set. That's actually a wine pourer, the one on the left, and a teapot, which is on a stand. This pot was also made just a few months ago, and this one about a year ago. This is a glaze that I developed sometime in the 90s, I think, or late 80s, and it gives me great pleasure to see this glaze all around the United States. I love. It's a very popular glaze, and I love it. And you know, it's something that really is to me a real pleasure. You know, because you know, a glaze never makes a pot. It's the glaze and how you use it that makes the pot. But certainly, helping people find something that they might not have has always been a pleasure to me. I'm also working quite a bit with slips now. So this is my very new work, this sort of thing. These are colored slips carved through with glaze over the top. This is an older piece. This is another example of that, colored slips. And here I'm using that chrome effect, by the way. I have in that slip a high percentage of chrome, and I have a little tin in this glaze, so all that coloration is coming from the volatilization of the chrome from the slip. I'm also coming back to porcelain, which I have used on and off, but not extensively. But now I'm starting to work more in porcelain, and this bowl is porcelain with a slip. You'll also notice something now. These are the last few slides. We're getting to the end, and you'll notice that these are real slides. That is, they're not slides that I have taken. They're slides that a professional has taken. Anyway, this is all recent work. And these are large platters, and they're all done with colored slips. And here again with sgraffito, and here sgraffito and brushing and so on. As I've told you, drawing is a crucial part of the creative process for me, and has always been. And you know, sometimes it finds its expression on the piece, and sometimes just on paper. And the idea transfers to me somehow in that, between those two. But sometimes it's also on the piece. I wanted to show you the piece on the right because Emily used that piece in its fired form on the publication from the Northern Clay Center. But that's the way it looked with just the slips on it before I put the glaze on it, and my tendency to make extra lids. I really went to town on this one. But I'll tell you, though, it ended up just with that one. So this is another pot in my return to the rolled over form. These are the last two slides, and this is at this point, this is where my thinking is about the reference to the column. And again, it's perfectly obvious, you know, but I've begun playing with this element a lot. And I'll tell you one reference to that. When my mother made pies, she had extra dough. Do you know what I'm getting at? And you take these little strips and you put the cinnamon on and you roll it up. And that's exactly what I do with these. So I'll end this by saying again that what I hope I communicate is that in these 50 years approximately, my passion and feeling about clay just gets stronger all the time. Thank you very much. Thank you, thank you. So let me say now, too, Emily said it was okay to have questions, so if that is appropriate, I'm willing to do that. I know this is often that embarrassing moment in a talk when, see, but maybe, yes. Yes, I do. That's a habit that I can't get over. If you didn't hear the question, I always fire lids on the pot. And I learned that partly from sad experience of firing lids separate and then have them warp in funny little ways and not fit anymore. And you know, when you fire it on the pot, it's safer in that respect. But I know what you're thinking. The weight of the lid might maybe make the rollover go down further. I don't know if you were thinking that, but you know, that hasn't happened, you know, and I mean, this of course is if you're firing high fire. If you're firing low fire with porous clay, you don't have to worry about those things so much, you know, but certainly when you're using a vitreous clay or a really dense clay, then the tendency to move is pretty strong. Yes?
Well, that brings up the question with your penchant for making extra lids.
Yeah, why do they, well?
When you're going to fire on the pot, or do you make little holders for all the...
Yes, I do. I make little shrinkage slabs. You know what I mean? Just a little slab, and you fire the lid so the slab shrinks, but not the lid. You know, they go together. But I also, structurally, when I make the lid, I always thicken the part of the lid that sits in the flange. You know, in the cross-section of the clay, you just make it stronger. You know, so that certainly helps, you know. And I'm probably over conservative about that, you know. I mean, some of you are firing lids off and not having any problems at all. You know, I don't know. There was another hand, yes.
I just have a question. I'm going to be studying at the University of Wolverhampton this coming fall.
Are you?
Yeah, this academic year. And how was your experience there?
Well, my connection to it goes back further than I just said. When I went to England on a Fulbright, that was 1975, and I was in Manchester. I taught teaching in Manchester, but the Fulbright was an exchange program of faculty. So a teacher from Wolverhampton came to Alfred, and I went to Manchester, which doesn't seem to make much sense, but nevertheless, I got to know Pam Salter, who was the teacher then from Wolverhampton. And then my wife and I have been back to England several times, and they're very close friends. Her husband, Jeff, is also a potter, and they both taught at Wolverhampton. And so, you know, now they have both retired, so you won't get the pleasure of working with them. But it's a strong faculty. They have good facilities. I'm not sure where are you doing your work now?
At the University of Minnesota.
Uh-huh. Well, the facility won't be as good as that, but it's good. You know, it's...
They just actually put like $5 million into a new facility.
That's right. So they're going. You mean here or there?
Up in Wolverhampton.
Yeah. And you know, it's we loved it there. You know, Wolverhampton is an old kind of industrial city in England. It's not London, but it's only a couple hours away in the train to London. You know, and but there's some lovely people there, and you know, it's very close to Wales. You know, it's a short trip to get to Wales from there. I mean, it's no, you know, and I know the faculty there, and they represent quite different approaches and so on. And I don't know if you're interested in mold making, but they have an incredible opportunity for that. They have a guy teaching there who came out of industry and knows everything about molds and so on. So,
Great, thank you so much.
Sure. Yes.
Did you enjoy working with electric kilns when I think it was in England? And did you come up with any discoveries or notice anything? Or how did that go?
I didn't finish that story because I was aware that I'd gone way longer than I had planned to go. Um, I'm going to tell you a story about Emily. When we were talking about this, and I asked Emily, well, you know, roughly how long should I take in this presentation? And she hesitated a minute, and she said, well, there are two ends of that. She said, we had a speaker in this series once who spoke a little bit less than an hour. And then we had Bill Daly, who took 3 hours. And Bill Daly is a wonderful guy, and I've taken more time than I intended to do. But I did develop 4 or 5 new glazes for me that I used in oxidation, and 2, I actually didn't show you those. I showed only 2 of those pots, but it was very exciting to me, and I'm planning to come back to oxidation. I have to say, by the way, that there's a white stoneware body in Wolverhampton. That's one of the best clays I have ever used anywhere. It's just incredible, and I used it the whole time practically on my work. And it's a commercial clay. They buy it from a factory, you know, and then the students use it. I'll give you my personal feeling about that. In using the electric kiln, I wanted to use a light-colored white body. Porcelain, of course, would have been fine. I mean, but I preferred a white stoneware because I like the relationship of the glazes to the lighter body, whereas stoneware clays, unless you have a chance to develop something special, this is my personal feeling about this, stoneware clays have a tendency to be a kind of pale, buffy color, which for me doesn't respond well to what I like about glaze and clay relationships. So that's one thing I learned for myself about that. And I am going to continue working to some in oxidation. Many, many years ago, I wrote an article for Studio Powder about cone 4, 5, 6 oxidation firing, and I've read that recently again. And one of the things that I said in this towards the very end was after trying to encourage people all over, I mean, I listed all the advantage of electric kilns. You know, I mean, it's probably, if we ever reach the point where there's no fuel, the last thing to go will be electricity, it seems to me. So there's always going to be electricity. It's more predictable, it's more controllable, and so on, in a certain sense. And I talked about all this and gave recipes and so on. And then at the end, I finally said, the only thing now I have to do is to convince myself to fire an oxidation. So there we are.
Thank you. Okay, one last question.
This isn't a question. Val, it's been almost 40 years since I've worked with you at Alfred. And I want to say on behalf of that experience, it still is with me every day.
Wow,
and
that's great.
You were the finest man I ever worked with.
Wow.
Not only do I respect you as an artist, but as a teacher. And I just want to tell you how much I love you.
Thanks.
I have one wife.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you.
That was a great closing note, thank you. And here we have this sort of standard sort of National Press Club bag of goodies.
A mug? No.
Actually, a tumbler. We commissioned some tumblers from Warren Klopman to give to departing staff, departing board members, and visiting dignitaries. And an apron, and then publications and, various stuff. And then the Institute also has the treasures from the Minneapolis Institute of Arts.
Thank you very much.
So thank you very much for a wonderful lecture. Thank you.
Maybe I'll see some of you next March. right when the exhibition comes.
Yes.
I hope so.